welcome everyone to this this session of the Forest Technical Network on the New York Declaration on Forests. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining from today. It's really wonderful to have this opportunity to talk about this this key initiative related to forests. Let me start first just with a few formalities for the session. Just so you know, this session in the technical network will be held only in English. We will have a mixed session between a presentation by our guests, who I'll introduce in a moment, and then we'll have a moderated discussion, and you will all be invited to post any questions or comments in the chat as we go along. Myself, just two words, Astrid Agostini. I am the coordinator of REDD+ and National Forest Monitoring and the Forestry Division, and I'll moderate today's session. And it's a great pleasure for me to welcome today Clea Paz Rivera, who is the Senior Program Manager of International Forestry from UNDP, and Franziska Haupt, who's the Executive Director of Climate Focus in Berlin. Clea is an advisor with the New York Declaration on Forests and the Climate and Forests team, who specialize in forests and climate change, conservation planning, natural resource management, and public policies for biodiversity conservation and sustainable management. Some of you may know her well. She's previously worked also as UNDP's REDD+ technical advisor in Latin America and in the UN REDD Program Secretariat in Geneva, as well as for Conservation International in Bolivia. Franziska, who is based in Berlin, as I said, she co-leads the progress assessment of the New York Declaration on Forests, a collaborative effort by 28 research organizations and NGOs to measure progress towards its 10 goals. She's also lead author of some of the key progress reports towards the New York Declaration on balancing forests and development. And again, some of you may know Franziska because she has worked for many years also as a consultant, including for FAO in the past. It's wonderful to have this session, not just because it's thematically very important, but also, of course, we have a long-standing partnership with UNDP, our UN colleagues, working on forests, most notably, of course, since 2008, working in the UN REDD program. And the UN REDD program, of course, has been supporting more than 60 countries in realizing its REDD+ strategies, building up its systems, and realizing ambition on climate and forests. We also have a strengthened collaboration with UNDP in-house across the board, really through a memorandum of understanding. And climate change, again, is one of the priority areas, but also food systems. And so many of those areas we're working on in the MOU are also of direct interest and have some direct relationship with the topics we're discussing today under the New York Declaration. So what is it, this New York Declaration? Of course, you'll hear much more about this from our speakers, but it's a voluntary and non-binding international declaration to take action to halt global deforestation by 2030. It has key goals and a timeline to achieve these, and we will hear about what the progress has been to that so far and what some of the thoughts are in order to take it forward. Because in the end, all of this is supposed to contribute to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the Paris Agreement. The monitoring and an assessment of progress is also a key way of creating momentum towards realizing the promises that are already made, but also realizing, of course, greater ambition. So we'll hear today from Clea and Franziska about the progress made so far, what some of the plans are going into the future, going into the next phase in this partnership, and also how this relates to a number of other ongoing initiatives, whether it's the partnerships we have, such as the UN REDD program, but also, of course, the collaborative partnership on forests, which we are all members of, as well as the broader initiative under the UN Secretary General's call to turn the tide on deforestation. So without further ado, I will hand over to Clea first, and then with Franziska to take us through the update and an explanation of what the New York Declaration is and what progress has been made and what some of the thoughts are going forward. And again, the invitation to all of you to please pose any questions or comments in the chat, which we can then pick up in the discussion following the presentation. So Clea, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Astrid, and good morning, colleagues, and good afternoon and good evening. It's really a great pleasure to be participating in this session with FAO colleagues. As Astrid said, I personally been collaborating with FAO for the past 10 years in different capacities. So it really is this, I consider this a session among friends. And I think it's also very important to, and it's a good time to strengthen cooperation and collaboration about among all the initiatives that are supporting forest and climate change efforts as we are entering this very critical decade where we must really turn the tide on deforestation. So I'm gonna share my screen. Give me a second here. And let me see. Okay. Can you see it now?
We can see your screen, but we don't see it in presentation mode, Claire.
Okay, let me just see. Just gonna do it again. Share. And now? Now should be working.
Yes, perfect, thanks.
Great, fantastic. So as Astrid introduced, we're gonna deliver this presentation jointly with my colleague, Franziska Haupt. And I'm gonna start just talking briefly about some general aspects of the declaration and the global platform, which is the partnership that supports the declaration. So as Astrid introduced, the New York Declaration on Forests was launched at the UN Secretary General's Climate Summit in September 2014, ahead of the climate change meeting in Paris, really with the intention of building political momentum and high-level support for the inclusion of forests in the Paris Agreement. It's a voluntary political declaration that has been endorsed by more than 200 governments, companies, NGOs, and indigenous peoples and local communities organizations. Includes 10 ambition goals with the ultimate goal of aiming to end natural forest loss by 2030, but each of the goals covers a different thematic area that is necessary to address deforestation at a global level. So the goals, the first goal is what we consider the umbrella or overarching goal that intended to halve the rate of loss of natural forests by 2020 and strive to end it by 2030. Goal 2 focuses on deforestation from agricultural commodity production and working with the private sector. Goal 3 aims to significantly reduce deforestation derived from other economic sectors, including infrastructure, mining, and other development sectors that are non-agricultural development sectors. Goal 4 focuses on supporting alternatives to deforestation driven by subsistence farming and other small-scale activities in a way that alleviates poverty and promotes sustainable development and equitable development. Goal 5 is focuses on restoration and is aligned with the Bonn Challenge, and it had an intermediate target of restoring 100 million hectares of forest by 2020 and increase the rate of global restoration by 200 million by 2030. Goal 6 is related to the SDGs, and at that time in 2014, it intended to include ambitious quantitative forest and conservation and restoration targets on the post-2030 development, the post-2015 development framework as part of the international sustainable goals. Goal 7 is related to REDD+, and it aimed to agree in 2015 to reduce emissions from deforestation and forest degradation as part of the post-2020 global climate agreement, in accordance with the Paris Agreement goals. Goal 8 it tends to provide support for the development and implementation of strategies to reduce forest emissions, what we know as phase 2 of REDD+. And goal 9 is focused on rewarding countries and jurisdictions by taking actions on reducing emissions, particularly to public policies and scale up payments for verified emission reductions and private sector sourcing of commodities. And last but not least, a very important goal is goal 10, that is, it aims to strengthen forest governance, transparency, and the rule of law, and also empowering communities, realizing the rights of indigenous peoples, especially those related to land and resources. So as you can see, a very broad, comprehensive set of, an ambitious, very ambitious set of goals that were agreed at the beginning on the declaration. As I mentioned, we have 200 endorsers from 41 national governments, 22 subnational governments, 22 indigenous peoples and local community organizations, and 62 companies. Oh, now it's not moving. I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Well, and then since 2014 and what really after the Paris Agreement, what was happening at in the NYDF was just the assessment. There was an assessment report launched every year since 2015, and my colleague Francisca is going to explain much more about these assessment reports. But the declaration did not have a supporting structure that will accompany the implementation of the declaration. So beyond the assessment, not much happened until 2017, where we launched the global platform for the New York Declaration on Forests. And the platform has 4 partners, UNDP, Meridian Institute, Climate Advisors, and Climate Focus. And the platform really focuses on convening and facilitating multi-stakeholder dialogues among our endorsers, develop partnerships and fostering collaboration, capture and sharing multi-stakeholder knowledge on forest action challenges, barriers, and best practices. And also, we really try to showcase cases or best cases and best practices using our multiple knowledge management and communication tools, and promote collaboration among our endorsers. The NYDF assessment partners that are led by Climate Focus evaluate the progress annually toward meeting the NYDF 10 goals. And you can see they're listed here on the right side of the slide. They're NGOs from the Global North and also from the Global South. And Francisca is going to explain what the assessment have been finding, the main findings on of the assessments that have been carried out yearly since 2015. So as we reach the 5th anniversary of the declaration and realizing that the 2020 intermediate targets, several of the 2020 intermediate targets were not met, we launched a refresh process of the NYDF early this year. And in this process, we're looking at updating the text of the goals, and more importantly, the action agenda, which is a document that accompanies the declaration and looks into provide guidance for implementation on the goals, but also highlight how collaboration with other relevant initiatives and processes could strengthen action towards the NYDF goals. So the purpose of this refresh is to relaunch or refresh political will and ambition to meet the 2030 targets on the goals, including and incorporating the lessons learned and progress to date, drawing mainly from the assessment reports. Maintain NYDF as a global multi-stakeholder framework for forest action, and this is because in this refresh process we interviewed all our endorsers and also several key partners, And we've heard over and over again that the NYDF still considered as a comprehensive, relevant framework for forest and climate change. So, and especially because it has this multi-stakeholder group of endorsers from all the sectors that are considered necessary to address deforestation at a global level. So we launched a process with a working group of endorsers that has met throughout this year. We had focal sessions, nine dialogues on each of the NYDF goals with 25 participants across the endorser groups. And we carry out 30 bilateral consultations with key partners and other stakeholder groups. And we are now in the process of revising the text of the goals in a way that maintains the integrity of the declaration and will not require a re-endorsement, but will update reference to the 2020 targets that of course have not been met, and make the necessary adjustments to make sure we have some strong 2030 targets reflected. The refresh declaration and draft action agenda will be finalized by November of this year, and launch trying to convene all stakeholders in a way that we will reinvigorate the momentum towards the NYDF, but also to global forest and climate change goals. So with this, I'm going to hand over to Francisca, who's going to talk about the NYDF progress assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, Clea. Can you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Very well.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to share the findings of the progress assessment. So over the years, we have published a number of reports, as Clea mentioned, starting in 2015, in where we basically established indicators for all of the goals to measure progress. In 2015, we assessed progress towards goal 2, deforestation driven by agricultural commodities. The following year, a report on finance, the goals 8 and 9. And then another report the following year on governance, goal 10. And then the following year, we looked at the core goals, in a way, the flagship goals of the declaration, protecting and restoring forests, because this was the 5-year anniversary of the NYDF. And then in 2020, we assessed one of the more difficult goals, how deforestation driven by sectors like extractive industries, mining, and linked to unsustainable livelihoods is being addressed. So this is a lot of information, and we're obviously not able to share all of it. We're presenting some highlights today. Just to emphasize again that this is a collaborative product that we produce with our partners. There are 28 organizations involved, more or less for different topics, depending on their expertise. Next slide.
It's not letting me change the slide. I don't know why. It kind of froze. I'm sorry. I don't know. Okay, now, sorry.
So goal 1, halving the rate of loss of natural forests globally by 2020 has not been achieved. And the second part of the goal, striving to end natural forest loss by 2030. So it doesn't really matter which data set you consult. We're combining usually Global Forest Watch and FAO data from the Forest Resource Assessment. It's clear that we're not on track and that we have not met the 2020 milestone. We're currently losing 10 million hectares of forest per year, based on multiple estimates of permanent deforestation. And if we want to stop deforestation and be on track for the 2030 goal, we would need to decrease by an average of 1 million a year. And if we don't manage to do that in 1 year, we'll need to make up the following year. So this is very ambitious still, the 2030 goal. Just to give also an example that we're actually moving further away from the targets. If we look at primary forest loss in the humid tropics, annual loss has actually increased by 41% since the NYDF was adopted in 2014. Next slide. Our second flagship goal, restoring forests. Here, the NYDF essentially refers to the bond challenge. Which is slightly more ambitious than the goal itself. So currently pledges total 170 million hectares. Here, our ability to assess progress is challenged because data is really incomplete. I mean, we know the commitments, but that obviously doesn't really say a lot about progress. And if we look at the available information, we can only conclude that we're not on track. So there is a lot of political will, but since 2000, only 18% of the 2020 goal has been realized. As increases in forest cover or tree cover. And looking at case studies, so as pictured here, the map, we did assess El Salvador, Costa Rica, and Guatemala, and it shows that they do have net increases in tree cover between 2011 and 2018. But Belize, Honduras, and Nicaragua had net losses. So there is a highly dynamic nature of tree cover, and there are usually large losses and gains in each country. We also looked at the Mekong region in Southeast Asia and found that restoration is taking place, but overall there is still a net loss of natural forests, so it's not compensating. And the results also showed that there's 3 times more restoration outside of forest rather than in forest, so in croplands and shrublands, and this is happening at a rate of 75%. Overall, we can say that restoration is not replacing, or it's not a good substitute to halt deforestation. I mean, also the pledges under the bond challenge, they're planned to be implemented by half by monoculture plantations, a third with natural regeneration, and 21% through agroforestry. Next slide. So this goal is about supporting and help meet the private sector goal of eliminating deforestation from agricultural commodities. So commercial agriculture is the major driver of deforestation, and it causes the destruction of more than 5 million hectares of forests every year. And most of it happens in Southeast Asia and Latin America, especially palm oil, cattle, and soybean, depending on the region. So after a peak in 2016, tree cover loss from this driver has declined, but it's just as high as before 2014. Many companies have made commitments to address this problem, and our partners Supply Chain and Forest 500 have looked at the companies that are exposed to forest risks and conclude that more than half of them have made a commitment. But it's much less clear how they've progressed on these commitments. So many companies fail to disclose progress on how they're addressing deforestation in their supply chains. So, for example, Forest 500 estimates that of the 350 most influential companies in these supply chains, only a third did not disclose information. So 2/3 disclosed information. In recent years, we've seen a lot of development in developing traceability technologies and monitoring technologies, which would allow for risk assessment and tracking and engagement with producers for these companies. But the problem is that so far the engagement is often limited. It doesn't really go far back in the supply chain. So very often it's just going to processors or refiners and doesn't reach the producers where the deforestation is taking place, and especially not reaching all the smallholder producers, which are very prevalent in some supply chains like cocoa. There's also a risk that even if there are these commitments and efforts to clean up supply chains, the production that is linked to deforestation can be absorbed by markets that don't set any requirements, for example, from some emerging economies. Next slide. The finance goals. We did a big report on this in 2017, and one of our key findings is that there is a lot more funding going to the sectors that drive deforestation than finance that is supporting forest protection or aligned with climate goals. Gray finance is not necessarily bad, but it doesn't really, it can be bad for forests because it doesn't necessarily have safeguards that would ensure that impacts are mitigated. Forests are also receiving a relatively small share of climate finance, only 1.5%. Compared to, for example, renewable energy, even though they present a large share of the mitigation potential. We also look at how much results-based finance has been spent for REDD+. So recently, the disbursements have definitely picked up. For a while, a lot of money was just sitting there. NICFI and the Norwegian Climate and Forest Initiative and the GCF and also the bilateral program REDD Early Movers by the German government have dispersed quite a lot of funds. But there's still a bit of a problem with slow disbursement for other initiatives. Next slide. And an example of some of our findings from last year, where we looked at how infrastructure and extractives are driving deforestation and what is being done about it. So one of our highlights was that there is an immense threat from these drivers. They're not talked about very much. And the problem is also not so much their direct impact, but that they really open up forest areas for all sorts of other activities. What we did here was we show an overlap of forest areas with infrastructure plans. So basically plans by governments to develop economic corridors, and also concessions for mining and oil palm. On the left side, you see the Congo Basin. On the right side, you see the Amazon. I'll shortly show Southeast Asia as well. But this is really alarming because if these plans go ahead, they could basically kettle in the remaining forest areas and the people that live there and make it so much more vulnerable for all sorts of other drivers, creating access for all sorts of economic development. And what we found in our report is that very often these decisions for the so-called mega projects are taken at the very top levels of government. And with very little buy-in or say for those that are impacted by these decisions. And they're also often, or we couldn't find evidence that they're paired with investments in social development that would somehow help to mitigate some of the impacts and not just open it up for uncontrolled agriculture, mining and extraction and whatever. Next slide. Oh, I think the slide actually didn't end up in the copy, the one for Southeast Asia, but it's a similar picture. In that report, we also looked at some of the barriers to progress. So what is actually hindering that these commitments, like the NYDF goals, are translated into implementation? Ah, great. I think that's now the slide for Southeast Asia as well. I'll let you look at it quickly. Okay, next slide. Yeah, what are the barriers to progress? One of the big cross-cutting themes is that there is not a lot of transparency. This concerns, on the one hand, how the endorsers, or even beyond the endorsers of the NYDF, report on how they implement their commitments. So there's not a lot of transparency or information to find when it comes to concrete impact of these pledges or their implementation and the steps that are taken. A lot of it is kept vague. But then there's even more of a problem of transparency if we look at business as usual actions in these sectors that drive deforestation. For example, how are decisions on infrastructure development taken? How are mining rights allocated? This is something that is not very transparent and hindering progress, obviously, because if we don't have information, we can't hold anyone accountable. The second problem is that governments often grapple with implementing their policies because they don't have the political will, they don't have the capacity, or the institutions that are in charge of forests or environment don't have the capacity. Or there's also a lack of stability in these countries. There's also an imbalance in power among the government agencies. As you all know, I'm sure, forest agencies often don't have a lot of power compared to those that are economically more influential. And this allows vested interests to shape how government policy is enforced. On paper, it often looks much better than in practice. There's also a challenge in addressing smallholder needs or the needs of rural populations and indigenous peoples in local communities. There are some interventions to address poverty and deforestation, but they're quite challenging to scale and bring the complementary investments that are needed to address this complex problem in terms of creating market access, enabling the rights for farmers, for example. There are many different things that are needed, and it's difficult for governments or other actors to address this. There's also a power struggle between governments and companies on the one hand, and or not a struggle, that's really a disparity, and indigenous peoples and local communities and small scale actors who just have very little say in how economic development is promoted in these countries, how forest land is allocated and used, and customary land ownership and territorial sovereignty of indigenous peoples often not recognized and undermined. And practices or processes like free, prior, and informed consent is often just a checkbox exercise that is not taken very seriously. Finally, there's also a challenge in that consumer countries don't yet take a full responsibility for the impacts of all the products they're importing. So that there's definitely a disconnect in that these externalities are quite distant and unrelatable to citizens living in consumer countries. I mean, increasingly also consumers in emerging economies. Nobody really feels responsible, and there's a bit of a vacuum. Next slide. Just to give an example, we have in this last report also started for the first time to give explicit recommendation. I mean, these are rather high level since we're working on a global report. This shows some of the strategies we have used essentially to measure progress. And this is what we would have liked to see. And one of the key strategies is that we can't really continue with this system of unsustainable exploitation of resources and excessive consumption. So all countries and all decision makers need to think about alternative pathways. The second strategy is that forests need to be valued and embraced at the very top, at the very beginning of macroeconomic planning. They are a core value among other SDGs that need to be considered very carefully. And it needs to be weighed carefully if the impact that all of these development activities have on them is justified by sustainable development benefits. We're not saying that all forests can be saved, but there could be a much better process of assessing the trade-offs for forest and also make sure that these developments benefit the people, including those that live in these areas. This is not happening now. Another strategy is applying the mitigation hierarchy. This essentially means that in considering these developments as a first step, we need to try and mitigate their impact, avoid it where possible, and only offset it as a last resort if they're really not avoidable. And then another strategy is applying the PRIME framework. This, I won't go into detail, but it's a framework that brings together the different interventions that are needed to address this complex field of promoting sustainable livelihoods while also addressing deforestation. Like I mentioned, investing in rights, but also in infrastructure, public services, promoting productivity, ecosystem payments, and so on. Next slide. Yeah, the broad lessons, unfortunately, a bit grim. I mean, forests are under threat by an increasing demand for natural resources. This is fueled by global markets, by power imbalances, by weak governance. This is the global picture. Obviously, there are some examples, some great initiatives that are very promising, and they're examples of great progress. So we know what is needed. We know the solutions and the comprehensive set of policies and incentives that can stop deforestation and enhance forests. We also realized that the 2020 targets were quite ambitious. I mean, maybe they weren't ambitious in light of the threat that we face here for forests and the climate crisis where forests play an important role. But it's clear that the barriers were just too big and that the endorsers and the broader global community weren't able to move from commitment to action. The global platform has only been operational since 2018 or to the end of 2017, I think. And it took time to rebuild the momentum. The assessment started this in 2015, right after it was adopted. But only now, we have managed to mobilize the endorsers and renew the buy-in to this declaration to make sure it's not just a piece of paper. Another opportunity is that the NYDF really offers the most comprehensive framework for voluntary forest goals. It can serve as a space and platform for other initiatives. There are a lot right now. It has this comprehensive view on forests, looking at all the drivers, including some that were probably not very prominent in the discussions previously, like infrastructure and mining. But it also looks at all the strategies that are needed to save forests, from governance, finance, international collaboration. There are also the goals that link the NYDF to the SDGs and to the Paris Agreement. Yeah, and then final note, I mean, obviously, it's very critical that we address deforestation. And yeah, I look forward to your feedback, your thoughts, your questions. Really excited about this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Claire and Francisco, for this comprehensive overview and for taking us through step by step the various goals and where we stand, as well as some observations really on the lessons that we can draw already, or that you've been able to draw from the progress reports, as well as the engagement now on thinking what to do going forward. And I'm sure there's going to be a number of questions and maybe also observations from various colleagues participating here, but I can take my moderator's privilege and start with one. And I think one of the aspects that's really interesting that you touched upon lightly, but it'd be very fascinating to hear a bit more of your thoughts on, is this aspect of voluntary versus mandatory. No, I mean, obviously the New York Declaration is very much a voluntary framework. You stress that. it's good in the sense of trying to create a coalition around the shared goals, getting kind of this mobilization. But on the other hand, Franziska, I think you also mentioned the fact that in some cases, for instance, consumer countries didn't quite take their responsibilities for the impacts they have through their demand. And there, of course, we see now a huge dynamic. We see this new developments of regulatory frameworks. We know the EU is planning and very shortly coming forward with regulations precisely looking at products placed on the European market and eliminating deforestation to the greatest possible degree from those products. Similarly, in the UK and also in the US, there's now developments in this area. So what do you see, how do you see these initiatives interacting, or what do you see the relationship between the voluntary on the one side and then the more mandatory binding regulatory approaches? How do you think they can reinforce each other? And also in that context, what is our role to try and drive both of those forward in a way that we can make most progress?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. No, I think you make a great point. I mean, we need both. I think we need the voluntary commitment. I mean, these are in a way the champions, right? They need to show the way, but then we also need the mandatory rules to follow, to create certainty and to slowly increase the ambition of everyone. Otherwise, there will always be some actors that don't really do anything, and that will kind of offset the success of the ones that act. The EU is actually planning a combination of mandatory and voluntary due diligence rules, which I think is really promising. And what is also really interesting about that is that the private sector is fully supportive of the mandatory regulations. So yeah, I think this is a very positive development, and I think in the long run we do need both. Maybe Clea wants to add.
Clea, please come compliment. Thanks, Franziska.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to add that I think also, and this was highlighted in Goal 2 report, that it, of course, is very promising to see that there is this demand side policies that are being strengthened in the EU and the US and other countries, but also there's a risk of the demand shifting to other markets that don't have the same standards. So that's where I see that we also need collaboration way beyond NYDF, and we need to collaborate with initiatives that are engaging with China, India, and other markets. So, and this is, I think, an important point that's coming out of the refresh as well, is that we by no means think that the organizations that are supporting NYDF can be in charge of supporting implementation. It's very broad. We need really radical collaboration with all the initiatives that are engaged in moving forward these goals, including those that are engaging with these key countries that are not either not endorsers or that are playing a very important role in markets for agricultural commodities. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. Absolutely. And I think you give some key pointers about, in the end, we need a kind of multiplicity of strategies, and one alone probably won't cut it. Well, as we've seen from the limited progress on some of the very ambitious 2020 goals, we'll need more hands on deck and more instruments probably. And since you were highlighting this momentum of the refresh, we have a question here from Margot, which I wanted to directly pick up and put to you, which is about the role of what's going to happen at COP26. Can you tell us a little bit more about how NYDF is going to engage in COP26 and how this will be a milestone in this refresh process?
Yeah, I can take that one. Thanks a lot. Well, I think we're still discussing. We submitted a proposal for a high-level event but we haven't really. I think the UK co-presidency is still looking into how to package all the submissions that they have received and how to organize what they want to see as a high-level momentum for forest. So I don't have a clear answer to that question because we don't know yet. We're waiting to hear more details. But for sure, what we do want to support that forests are playing an important role at COP26. And I think one message that we want to convey from NYDF is that there's no need for additional commitments or declaration. There is a commitment declaration exhaustion. We've heard that from many of the forest countries. So in that way, and that's why, I mean, the refresh, we're really looking to just reinforce the 2030 goals and to try to focus on implementation and enhance collaboration to meet these existing commitments rather than creating or you know, thinking on new additional commitments. Francisca wants to complement. Thanks.
Yes. It's not quite at COP, but in September, we're planning to launch a report on Goal 7, which is about the implementation of the Paris Agreement related to forests. So we're currently finalizing our first draft, assessing the ambition of NDCs. So basically national climate pledges for forest. Also putting that in context of the mitigation potential and emissions. We're also looking at finance going to forests and assessing the implementation, but all of it rather forward-looking and constructive, because many countries have only started implementing their NDCs. So we're compiling best practices from now more than a decade or 2 decades of REDD+ and forest conservation efforts.
Thank you, and I'm sure we'll all be looking forward to seeing that report, which is relevant, not, I think, well beyond the New York Declaration. In fact, some key topics there that we're also trying to tackle or do our part to tackle with. So, and I'm wondering, in this one other aspect that relates also to this aspect, to the point of the momentum for implementation, is on the one hand, I was wondering whether you could also say a little bit more about the role of this multi-stakeholder engagement, now on the New York Declaration, because we have the goals, the SDGs, of course, those are the countries signed up to these. The thing that's very interesting with the New York Declaration is precisely you showed that that there's different, obviously, countries have signed up to this, companies have signed up to this, civil society partners have signed up to this, and I think it'd be very interesting to hear a bit more from you about what some of the insights are about how this can be mobilized in a positive way to have a reinforcement of different activities. One risk you highlighted to some extent is also the kind of shared voluntary ambition. Also, everyone can be off the hook in a way. You can kind of the progress is joint and lagging behind is kind of nobody is fully responsible. So how can you kind of reap the dynamism of these different stakeholders in a way that we can also draw lessons from for other initiatives and precisely for meeting the SDGs and the Paris Agreement?
I mean, it's a hard question. I don't know if there's a simple answer to that question. I think there's an issue about alignment, and that also we've heard from endorsers as well. I mean, there's there's a perception that there's way too many declarations and commitments and global goals that are not necessarily aligned. So one thing we will look to do in the action agenda and the refresh process is to explain that, to explain how NYDF could, you know, relates with another partner initiatives, and how alignment and you know, could be enhanced. So we're going to be looking at that in the action agenda process, and I think from our side, our focus is going to be mainly to support our endorsers and well, any future endorsers on providing more concrete guidance on how to move, how to take into account the recommendations from the assessment, and also the best practices and lessons that we're learning through our collaborative discussions into concrete inputs for accelerating implementation at a country level. That's where I think it's missing. And we can do that, of course, in partnership with all the relevant initiatives that are working towards the same goals. Francisca, you want to complement here?
Yeah, just from the viewpoint of the assessment. So what we are planning for the future, we're currently developing our vision still, but is that we do want to have a bit more monitoring of specific endorsers. So right now we've always had a more global assessment, but we do want to collaborate more directly with the endorsers to hold them accountable, to provide guidance. And because we do have that great network of civil society, it's now 28 organizations, and we have a lot of knowledge there. We have a lot of capacity to set up collaboration between these organizations that are active in certain countries with that particular country, for example, or a certain group of stakeholders. So we hope to tap into that potential much more in the future. And I think the focus is definitely more and more on implementation. I mean, it's clear that we need to move away from monitoring pledges. Yeah, but how we get it done now.
Thank you. And I see there's a couple of questions in the chat that I wanted to pick up. One relates specifically, I think they're related. One relates specifically to the role of and I think it's the global platform, as you referred to it, no? That we said came in a few years after the actual New York Declaration was shaped, with the idea to kind of give more momentum. So, so the questions about what's the role of this platform specifically going forward in the implementation towards 2030 commitments. You've already said it's going to be more about implementation beyond monitoring, but it'd be interesting to understand more about what the role is then of these, you know, of these partners that are in the platform, maybe this platform mechanism. And related to that, maybe we combine it then directly also, Claire, especially for you, the question about also the relationship between that and the fact dialogues that are happening in preparation of COP26 that are of course also directly related. And maybe you can in fact say a couple of words about the fact dialogues and how they relate. So yeah, over to you for these aspects.
Okay, I can start with the last question on the fact dialogues. I think we see the fact dialogues as and actually all the work that TFA colleagues are doing as I think as of course very much related to Goal 2, and they are a key stakeholder and player on Goal 2. And the fact dialogue.
Claire, maybe I'm not sure everyone on this webinar knows what the fact dialogues are. So maybe just say a couple of words and.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not directly involved. Well, this is the fact dialogues are a UK-led process for FUR. Let me just find some more information because I'm not directly, so it's Forest, Agriculture and Commodity Trade Dialogues. And it's an initiative that has been launched by the UK COP26 presidency and is facilitated by the TFA, the Tropical Forest Alliance. And so we are not directly involved on that. We're participating from the task force along with other multi-stakeholder task force members, and UNDP supporting, facilitating one of the dialogues through our Green Commodities program, but this is not explicitly part of NYDF. But these dialogues are, I think, tackling, or the target is to look at the agriculture and commodities part of the equation. And this is, of course, related to Goal 2 of NYDF, but it doesn't cover all of NYDF, because as you saw, NYDF has goals that go beyond deforestation from agricultural commodity production. So I think how we see it is that the fact dialogues, the part that is not clear yet is I don't have clarity on what's going to be the outcome of these dialogues, because they are ongoing. There's a government-to-government process, and there's a multi-stakeholder fact dialogues that is informing this government-to-government process. But the outcome, what they're going to really deliver by the COP, is not yet defined, or at least I personally don't have that information, and I don't think in NYDF we have it. But we are just, you know, following up that dialogue, and we see it as a key deliverable in terms of the agricultural commodity production side of the equation. And we hope to complement that with the other elements that are broader that come out from NYDF. Yes. And the first question, let me see. The
That was more about the role of the platform.
The role of the platform. Yeah. So we are in this year is a transition year because we're undergoing this refresh process that we explained, and we're also implementing new agreed deliverables for this year that we agree with our donor. The donor of the global platform is Germany. So we agree a set of 4 priorities for this year. And we're based among those 4 priorities is to define what's going to happen post 2021. So we're currently working on this at the moment, but for sure we want to take advantage of we want to put a lot of emphasis on the comparative advantages of the organization. So climate focus leading the assessment and the accountability side of NYDF. UNDP really focusing much more on translating this information to a country level and taking advantage of our in-country presence to drive action from this global to translate this global information to the country level, but also to bring country experiences to inform much more actively what is going on in the declaration at a global level. Climate advisors linking with global advocacy and campaigns, and also with the US government, and Meridian facilitating the work of the platform and facilitating partnerships with other relevant initiatives. So that's kind of the roles of the organizations within the platform. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I think it's very interesting for us also. FAO has not been a member such of the New York Declaration, but you've already outlined quite a number of follow-up actions that need to go into this refresh, where you've highlighted certainly areas where we would also see FAO having to play a role. And I think it'd be interesting to hear from you if you have further thoughts, and otherwise also in the follow-up to see how we can best collaborate in this context to get the momentum and the achievement going forward.
For sure, and I think FAO has a critical role to play especially on forest monitoring, which is so important such an important element for moving forward with NYDF. And I think there's a lot that we can do to strengthen that collaboration, Astrid, and also of course with the UN-RED program that I personally have been part of, and that is supporting at a country level many processes that are relevant for NYDF. We're trying to really enhance how the way that we are capturing that progress and the way that we feature, and also to look for opportunities to have more events together and to take advantage of what we are doing in the different initiatives to support countries in a more coordinated and enhanced manner. That I think it's always going to be relevant, and it's a need.
Thank you very much. And in fact, it's great you're referring already to, of course, some of the key partnerships we already have, including the UN-RED partnership, where we will certainly pick up some of these matters. And I think it's also very much an element of the strategic framework we have, looking at obviously addressing drivers of deforestation, looking particularly also at some of the threats coming from the agriculture and commodities sector, but also looking at the financing side, of course, which you've highlighted as a challenge, and trying to see how we can channel greater finance to countries who, not just for those who have achieved it, which is now a big focus, of course, on the results-based payments, but also still to help those countries really move forward in their forest climate ambition in the context of enhanced NDCs. I think it's been a super interesting hour to hear from you on your insights on the New York Declaration, and I think there are too many aspects to capture in any form of wrap-up. Certainly, we, in addition to this, we already discussed on the UN-RED partnership. Another big place where, of course, we have a common agenda now is, I think we have both the chair and the co-chair here of the Collaborative Partnership on Forests, which in fact is chaired now by FAO and co-chaired by by UNDP, and this is another place where I'm sure many of these topics will be coming up, also both the technical and the political momentum for implementation. And I think we have heard from you many aspects that we can draw upon. I mean, the importance or the opportunity really of this voluntary initiative of bringing all these different stakeholders together, but the need, and for us also to be able to support, in fact, complementary interventions that come both on the voluntary side and on enhancing ways that certain more binding, whether it's regulatory approaches or other form of incentive structures, can be put in place to really see whether there is how we can kind of enhance the implementation. Also, one key aspect you highlighted is the role of country level action, of course, and there that we need to bring it from the commitments and the global ambition. In the end, the reality is what happens on the ground, and that often needs the kind of country buy-in, and that's certainly something where we, of course, as agencies with our country presence and country support would have a key role to play. And we will be glad to see the momentum of key events such as COP26, of course, to give greater momentum again to, as you said, we don't need more commitments. I think it was very clear, and it's an important message for us. I think no more new initiatives, or let's have fewer additional initiatives, and let's really focus on existing commitments, implementation, and also on bringing the various implementation routes together under these complementary initiatives and see how they can mutually reinforce. So I think that that gives us all quite a bit of homework. And we're very glad to have had these insights from you towards the end of the week, and inspiration for us to think through. And we look forward, really, a big thank you to our presenters, Claire and Franziska, to all those who've organized this webinar. And we really look forward to working together on delivering this ambition going forward. And thank you for all colleagues who joined.